November in Bergen is not merely a month, it is a siege of the senses. It is a time when the sun feels like a distant memory, and the North Sea mist clings to the mountains like a wet shroud. On November 29, 1970, the air carried a particular bite, a damp, bone-deep chill that suggested the arrival of a brutal winter. On this Sunday afternoon, a university professor, a man whose name would be etched into police files as the first witness to an impossible puzzle, decided to take his two young daughters for a hike. They chose the Isdalen Valley, a place of haunting, rugged beauty located in the shadows of Mount Ulriken. To the locals, Isdalen had another name, the Valley of Death. It was a title earned through centuries of grim folklore and tragic accidents. In the Middle Ages, the treacherous slopes were a notorious site for suicides. In the modern era, experienced hikers had vanished into its sudden fogs, never to return. But as the professor and his children traversed the scree slopes that afternoon, the silence of the valley was shattered not by the wind, but by a cry of pure, instinctive terror. The girls saw it first. Tucked away in a remote corner of the slope, wedged between a cluster of massive, moss-covered boulders, was a shape that looked, at a distance, like a pile of discarded, charred rags. But as the father approached, his academic curiosity was instantly strangled by a visceral, sickening realization. The air was thick with a cloying, heavy scent that no hiker should ever encounter in the wilderness, the unmistakable, sweet-rot odor of burned human flesh. Lying before them, sprawled across the jagged rocks, was the body of a woman. She was locked in what forensic experts call the pugilistic pose. Her arms were semi-flexed and raised toward the sky, a final, desperate instinct of the body to shield the face from an unbearable inferno. The fire had been merciless. Her front was a blackened landscape of carbonized tissue. Her face, once someone's daughter, someone's friend, was now an unrecognizable mask of ash. Yet, in a haunting contradiction, her back and the ground beneath her remained almost entirely untouched by the flames, as if she had been pressing herself into the cold Norwegian earth, begging it to extinguish the fire consuming her from within. The professor grabbed his daughters and forced them to turn away, shielding their eyes from a sight that would haunt their dreams for decades. At that moment, he believed he was a witness to a tragic accident. He could not have known that he had just stumbled upon the most protected secret of the Cold War era. He saw a corpse. The police, however, would soon see a masterpiece of professional erasure. When the first investigators arrived on the scene hours later, struggling up the steep incline with their heavy equipment, they expected a routine investigation, perhaps a case of a hiker caught in a freak accident or a tragic suicide. But Isdalen had prepared a stage that defied every standard operating procedure. Around the charred body, arranged with a strain, almost ritualistic precision, were several objects. It is here that the story stops being a tragedy and starts becoming a spy thriller. Next to the woman lay a bottle of Kloster Aquavit, a potent local liquor, but it was empty, its label stripped of any clue. There were two plastic bottles that, according to the sharp, chemical tang still lingering in the air, had once contained gasoline. There was a silver-toned drinking cup, an object far too elegant for a casual hike in a valley of death. And perhaps most chilling of all, a pink wool hat, lying a short distance away, looking remarkably clean, as if it had been placed there by someone else after the horror had concluded. The officers began to comb through every inch of the surrounding terrain. They looked for a wallet, a passport, a train ticket, any shred of paper that could give this woman her name back. The silence they received in return was deafening. There was nothing. The world around her was sterile. It was as if the woman who walked into Isdalen had decided to delete her existence from reality before the first match was ever struck. But the true shock came when the detectives began to examine the remnants of her clothing. In criminal investigations, the brand is often the lead. A tailor's tag from Paris, a shop label from London, a serial number from a watch. Here they found a void. Every single label on her coat, every tag on her dress, even the tiny marks on her undergarments had been meticulously cut away. Someone, possibly the woman herself, or someone far more sinister, had taken a sharp blade and surgically removed every clue regarding where these items were purchased. They wanted her to be no one. This was not just a murder, this was the systematic deconstruction of a human life. Who was this woman who burned to death in a valley where the sun does not shine for months? Why did she die in such agony, with a lethal dose of sleeping pills already circulating in her blood? And why did every piece of evidence scream that she was never supposed to be identified? The Valley of Death held its secrets tight as the night fell over Bergen, but the city did not yet know that in the luggage lockers of the local railway station, 2 suitcases had been waiting for days.
suitcases that would soon open a portal into a world of forged passports, wigs, and international espionage.
The investigation into the Isdal Woman did not begin in a lab. It began in the mud and ash of a place that felt cursed. As the morning of November 30th broke over Bergen, the Isdalen Valley was no longer a hiking trail. It was a fortress of secrets. The lead investigators, men hardened by years of looking at the worst of humanity, found themselves standing in a circle around the charred remains, paralyzed by a sensation that they weren't just looking at a crime scene, but at a puzzle designed by a genius. Every step they took had to be calculated, every stone overturned with the knowledge that the person who died here had been erased with professional precision. The first thing that struck the detectives was the cold, clinical arrangement of the items found near the body. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a struggle. It looked like a macabre still life painting. There were the bottles, yes, the aquavit and the plastic containers that had carried the accelerant, but there was also a small, battered watch. When an officer picked it up, he noticed something that sent a shiver down his spine. The watch didn't just stop. Its face had been smashed, and the glass was gone. But more importantly, there was no brand, no name, no serial number. It was a timepiece that told no history. Beside the body, they found a pair of rubber boots. In Norway, boots are a lifeline against the weather, usually marked with the owner's name or at least a manufacturer's logo. These boots were different. Someone had taken a knife or a heavy abrasive and scraped away the brand name from the soles and the sides. The texture of the rubber was scarred, a silent testament to the effort someone took to ensure these tracks could never be traced back to a specific store in a specific city. This theme of denial was everywhere. A silver spoon was found nearby, an expensive, well-crafted item, but the monogram, the family crest that should have been engraved on the handle, had been filed down until the metal was smooth and anonymous. As the sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy of the valley, the investigators moved to the woman's clothing. This is where the mystery turned from strange to terrifying. She was wearing multiple layers of high-quality clothing, suitable for the brutal Norwegian autumn. But as the forensic team turned over the singed fabric of her coat, they realized the tags were gone, not just torn off in a hurry, but meticulously unpicked with a seamstress's precision. The blue silk scarf, the wool stockings, the tailored trousers, every single piece of fabric had been stripped of its origin. There was no made in Italy, no dry clean only, no size charts. It was as if she had stepped out of a void, dressed in clothes that had never been sold in any shop on earth. The lead investigator, Harald Osland, knelt in the dirt, staring at a small pile of jewelry, a pair of gold earrings and a ring. In a typical robbery homicide, these would be the first things gone. But here they were, glinting in the gray light, left behind as if they were worthless, or perhaps left behind because they too carried no clues. They were generic, mass-produced designs that could have been bought in any jeweler from Moscow to Madrid. The message was clear. The motive wasn't money. The motive was silence. Then there were the pills. Scattered around the body like white confetti were dozens of Phenomel brand sleeping tablets. Some were half dissolved by the rain, others were still tucked into their foil blisters. Why were they there? Had she taken them willingly to numb the pain of the fire, or had someone forced them down their throat before striking the match? The presence of the pills suggested a suicide, but the lack of a suicide note and the extreme measures taken to hide her identity pointed towards something far more professional, a state-sponsored execution disguised as a lonely tragedy. The detectives began to bag the evidence, their movements slow and heavy. They found a small burnt remnants of a passport cover, but the pages inside, the pages that held the stamps of her travels, her photograph, her very name, had been ripped out and burned to ash. The fire hadn't been an accident of a campfire gone wrong. It had been a localized, intense blaze intended to destroy the head and the hands, the two parts of the human body that hold the most identity. As the team prepared to move the body from the valley, one officer noticed a final detail. A small blue plastic bag was tucked under a rock a few feet away. Inside was nothing but a few crumbs of bread and a piece of fruit. It was the most human thing they had found all day. It suggested that shortly before she became a blackened husk on a mountainside, she had sat down to eat. She had planned for a future, even if that future was only an hour away. The ice valley was giving up its physical evidence, but it was withholding the truth. The investigators left the scene with a sense of dread. They had a body, they had clues, and they had a crime scene. But in reality, they had a ghost. Every piece of evidence they touched didn't lead to a person. It led to a dead end. They were no longer just looking for a killer. They were looking for a woman who had been systematically deleted from the world before she was even dead. The silence of the Isdalen was about to be replaced by the frantic ringing of phones across Europe. But for now, the only sound was the wind whistling through the hollows, carrying away the last traces of a woman who never was.
The investigation now moved from the cold, rain-soaked rocks of Isdalen to the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the Gate Institute in Bergen. Forensic pathologist Dr. Jorgen Geertsen stood over the stainless steel table, ready to perform a task he had done thousands of times before. But this body was different. It wasn't just a victim, it was a fortress of secrets. As the scalpels moved and the bone saw hummed, the medical team realized that the outside of this woman, the zapped labels and the erased brands, was only the first layer of the mystery. The real story was written inside her bones and deep within her blood. The autopsy was grueling. The fire had been so intense that the exterior of the body was a carbonized shell, yet the internal organs remained remarkably preserved, as if they were time capsules waiting to be opened. The first major discovery was her stomach. Dr. Geertsen found no remnants of a last meal, but what he did find sent a shockwave through the room. There were dozens of undissolved phenomol tablets, a powerful sedative. They hadn't been fully digested, meaning they were taken shortly before she died. In total, the concentration in her blood suggested she had swallowed between 50 and 70 pills. Under normal circumstances, this dose would have put her into a coma-like sleep within minutes. But here was the terrifying contradiction. If she had taken enough pills to fall into a deep sleep, how did she end up on a remote mountainside, and how did she end up on fire? The analysis of her lungs provided the most haunting detail of the entire case. When the pathologist examined the bronchial tubes, he found soot. Carbon particles were lodged deep in her respiratory tract. This was the definitive proof. She was breathing when the fire started. The Isdal woman had been alive, though likely semi-conscious from the pills, as the gasoline-fueled flames licked her skin and the smoke filled her lungs. She had suffocated and burned simultaneously, unable to fight back or even scream. As the team moved to examine her physical condition, more anomalies appeared. She was estimated to be between 30 and 40 years old, with a height of about 164 centimeters. She was described as striking, with long, dark brown hair and a face that before the fire would have been considered elegant. But it was her teeth that held the most expensive clues. Her dental work was far beyond the standard for 1970s Norway. She had extensive gold bridgework and porcelain crowns, a level of dentistry that was only available to the very wealthy or those living in major European hubs like London, Paris, or Zurich. Even more peculiar, the style of the work was uniquely continental. The way the gold was shaped and the bridges were anchored pointed directly towards a dentist in Central or Southern Europe, possibly Germany or France. The investigators looked at her hands, but they found no calluses, no wedding ring mark, no scars from manual labor. These were the hands of someone who handled documents, someone who traveled, someone who lived in high-end hotels. Yet there were no fingerprints. The fire had been so strategically intense around her extremities that the pads of her fingers had been scorched away. It looked less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate attempt to thwart the most basic tool of police identification. Later that week, the lab results for her blood arrived. Beyond the sleeping pills, they found traces of alcohol, enough to suggest she had a drink, perhaps to wash down the pills, but not enough to be intoxicated. Everything about her internal chemistry suggested a woman who was being prepared. Was she being drugged by a captor who then set her on fire, or was she a desperate soul who took the pills to numb the pain of a ritualistic suicide? The police were leaning towards the latter until they saw the bruise on her neck, a small, deep-seated hematoma that looked like it had been caused by a blunt force or a heavy grip, occurring just before death. Dr. Geertsen stepped back from the table, his gloves stained, his mind racing. He had never seen a case where so much effort had been put into both killing someone and erasing them. She was a healthy woman, well-nourished, with the best dental care money could buy, yet she had died like a discarded animal in a desolate valley. As the medical team stitched the body back together, they felt a heavy sense of failure. They knew the what and the how, but the who was slipping further away. The autopsy report was filed, but it raised more questions than the police could answer. If she was a suicide, why the elaborate steps to hide her identity? If she was a murder victim, why the pills? The investigation was at a standstill until a tip came in from the Bergen railway station. 2 suitcases, unclaimed and forgotten in a locker, had been sitting there since before the body was found. The detectives rushed to the station, hoping that whatever was inside those bags would finally give the woman on the steel table her voice back. They were about to find out that the suitcases didn't just contain clothes, they contained the inventory of a professional ghost.
The search for the Isdal woman's identity had hit a wall of ash and silence until the investigation shifted to the Bergen railway station. There, in the cold metal rows of the luggage lockers, 2 suitcases had been sitting unclaimed since November 23rd, 6 days before the body was found. When the police turned the key and the heavy doors creaked open, they didn't just find a traveler's belongings. They found the carefully curated life of a person who existed only in the shadows. These suitcases were the black boxes of her life, yet instead of providing answers, they deepened the chilling mystery of who or what this woman truly was. As the detectives laid out the contents in a secure police room, the atmosphere grew heavy. The suitcases were high quality, made of tan leather, stylish but functional. But as they began to catalog the items, the Isdal pattern emerged again, more aggressive than before. Every single identifying mark had been purged. Not only were the labels on the clothes cut away, but even the brand names on her hairbrush, her makeup, and her vanity kit had been painstakingly scraped off with a blade. Even the labels on her non-prescription medicine bottles were gone. It was a level of paranoia that went beyond a mere desire for privacy. It was a professional standard of anonymity. Among the piles of elegant, dark-toned clothing, mostly expensive wools and silks, the police found several wigs. One was dark, another was blonde, and a third was a striking reddish-brown. Beside them lay several pairs of non-prescription glasses with heavy frames. These weren't for vision, they were for transformation. This woman wasn't just traveling, she was disguising herself, shifting her persona from one city to the next. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a tourist, but with someone trained in the art of passing, someone who could walk through a crowded hotel lobby and disappear into a different face by the time she reached the street. The spy kit continued to reveal itself. Tucked into the lining of the suitcase, the investigators found a collection of currencies from across Europe: Norwegian kroner, British pounds, Swiss francs, German marks, and Dutch guilders. In 1970, before the era of easy credit cards, carrying such a diverse and large amount of cash suggested a life on the move, crossing borders with a frequency that was rare for a lone woman of that time. Even more telling was what they didn't find: no diary, no letters, no photographs of family, no postcards. There was absolutely nothing that tied her to another human being on the planet. However, buried at the bottom of the second suitcase, they found the most significant clue of the entire investigation: a cryptic, handwritten notebook. The pages were filled with columns of alphanumeric codes, strings like O22N3M and P10012S. To a casual observer, they looked like nonsense, but to the investigators, they looked like a travelogue. This was the woman's shadow trail. After days of intense work by cryptographers and intelligence officers, the code was broken. It was a simple but effective system to track her movements. O stood for October, N for November. The numbers were dates, and the final letters were codes for cities: Bergen, Oslo, Stavanger, Paris, London. The notebook revealed that the Isdal woman had been crisscrossing Europe with frantic intensity. She was a ghost who haunted the luxury hotels of the continent. But when the police took these dates to the hotels, they hid a new layer of deception. In every city, she had used a different name: Claudia Tielt, Vera Schlosseneck, Alexia Zarna Merkez, Elizabeth Lienhauer. In total, she had at least 8 different identities, supported by 8 meticulously forged passports. The handwriting on the registration forms was the same: a distinct, elegant, continental script, but the stories she told the receptionists were always different. One day she was a traveling antique dealer, the next she was a wealthy widow on a shopping trip. Then there was the silver spoon. It was identical to the one found in the Valley of Death. Now that we had a clean version from the suitcase, they could see the manufacturer's mark. It was a brand sold in only a few select shops in Germany. This confirmed the dental report: she was from the heart of Europe. But as they looked closer at the spoon in the suitcase, they noticed that even here she had tried to scratch off the small jeweler's stamp. It was as if she was in a constant race against her own history, trying to stay one step ahead of anyone who might try to follow her. The final item pulled from the bag was a plastic shopping bag from a store called Oscar Rurtved's Footwear in Stavanger. This was the break they needed. The police rushed to the shop, and for the first time, someone remembered her. The shopkeeper's son recalled a woman who spoke broken English and had a strong, confident aura. She had spent a long time choosing a pair of blue rubber boots, the same boots that were found with the brand names scratched off in the Isdalen Valley. He remembered her because she was striking, but also because she seemed tense, constantly looking at the door as if expecting someone to walk in. The suitcases proved that the Isdal woman was a professional. She had the tools of an operative, the money of a shadow organization, and the discipline of a soldier.
She wasn't just a victim, she was a participant in a high-stakes game. As the detectives closed the tan leather bags, they realized the scale of what they were dealing with. The Valley of Death wasn't just a place where a woman died, it was the final destination of a mission that had gone terribly wrong. The question was no longer just who she was, but who she was working for, and what secret was so dangerous that it had to be burned out of existence.
As the police sat in the dimly lit headquarters, the walls were covered with photos that shouldn't have existed. They were 8 different passport photos, yet from each one, the same striking woman looked back. She had high cheekbones, dark, intelligent eyes, and an expression that was impossible to read. This was the Miss Locke persona, a name taken from one of her many hotel registrations, but in reality, she was a woman of 1,000 faces. The investigation was now moving into the world of deep-cover deception, where names were mere tools, and identity was as fluid as water. The detectives began a grueling trek through the luxury hotels of Norway. At the Hotel Neptune in Bergen, she was Alexia Zarna Merces from Slovenia. At the Hotel Viking in Oslo, she was Vera Schlossenek. The stories she told were always just plausible enough to avoid suspicion. To one receptionist, she mentioned she was an antique dealer interested in Scandinavian wood carvings. To another, she was a lonely traveler recovering from a recent illness. But the staff noticed things that didn't fit the profile of a typical tourist. She was described as extraordinarily observant. She would sit in the hotel lounges for hours, sipping tea, but her eyes were never on her book. They were on the door, watching everyone who entered and exited. One waiter in Stavanger remembered her because she was difficult. She had moved tables 3 times in one sitting, eventually choosing a spot in the far corner with her back against the wall, giving her a full view of the entire restaurant. When she ate, she did so quickly, with a military-like efficiency, as if she was waiting for a signal to leave at any moment. Most chillingly, she had a habit of changing her room almost immediately after checking in. She would claim there was a bad smell or too much noise, but the staff believed she was simply checking the sightlines, ensuring she had a clear path to the fire exit or a room that couldn't be easily watched from the street. The Miss Locke persona was a masterpiece of professional tradecraft. When the police analyzed her travel patterns, they realized she wasn't just visiting Norway, she was circling it. She would travel to a city, stay for 2 days, then take a train to a remote village, only to return to the city under a different name a week later. She was creating a noise in the records, a trail so tangled that no ordinary detective could follow it. This wasn't the behavior of a criminal. This was the behavior of an intelligence operative clearing her tail. She was afraid of being followed, and as the investigation would later suggest, she had every reason to be. The breakthrough came from the registration form she had filled out. In 1970, guests had to provide a passport number and a home address. The Isdal Woman had provided them all, but they were all dead ends. The passport numbers were forgeries, missing the correct number of digits, or using sequences that hadn't been issued yet. The addresses she gave, in Brussels, London, and Munich, didn't exist. She was mocking the system. She knew that by the time the hotel sent the forms to the local police, she would be gone, vanished into a new wig and a new name. But she made one mistake, or perhaps it was a cry for help. In one hotel, she had left a small scrap of paper in the wastebasket. It was a receipt for a long-distance phone call made to a number in Belgium. When the police tracked the number, it led to a public payphone in a busy district of Brussels. Someone had been waiting at that phone at a specific time. She wasn't acting alone. She was part of a network, a cell that operated across borders, using public infrastructure to stay invisible. The atmosphere in the hotel she visited was described as heavy. She didn't invite anyone to her room. She didn't make friends. The only person she was seen talking to was a man in the park in Stavanger. A witness described him as tall, wearing a dark trench coat, and looking Mediterranean. They didn't speak like lovers. They spoke like business partners, exchanging a few brief words before walking away in opposite directions. This was the only time she was ever seen with another human being. Shortly after this meeting, she boarded the train to Bergen, her final journey. As the police closed the Fritel files, they realized the tragedy of Miss Locke. She was a woman who had spent months, perhaps years, living in the finest hotels, eating at the best restaurants, and wearing the most expensive clothes, yet she was utterly alone. Every smile she gave was a lie. Every name she signed was a fiction. She was a ghost walking among the living, a woman who had sacrificed her true self for a cause that was now leading her toward the Valley of Death. The masks were beginning to slip, and the hunters were closing in. The next scene would take the police from the hotel lobbies to the most secret military bases in Norway,
where the true reason for her presence would finally begin to surface.
The investigation was no longer just a police matter. It had entered the cold, paranoid world of national security. As the detectives mapped the Isdal Woman's frantic travels, a chilling pattern emerged that had nothing to do with tourism or antiques. Her movements through the Norwegian fjords perfectly synchronized with the secret testing schedule of the Penguin missile, Norway's most advanced and highly classified naval weapon. The woman wasn't just a mysterious traveler. She was a shadow following the scent of cold, hard steel. The Penguin was a game-changer in the Cold War, a heat-seeking missile designed to defend the Norwegian coast from a potential Soviet invasion. In late 1970, the military was conducting live fire tests in remote coastal areas near Stavanger and Bergen. Every time a test was scheduled, the Isdal Woman was there. When a secret naval exercise took place in the fjords, she was staying in a hotel nearby. She wasn't just a ghost, she was an observer, a pair of eyes watching the horizon for the streak of a rocket. Witnesses began to emerge from the military's own backyard. A fisherman reported seeing a woman matching her description, standing on a desolate pier, binoculars in hand, watching a naval flotilla pass by. She wasn't taking photos of the sunset, she was timing the ships. In another instance, an officer recalled seeing a woman at a remote crossroads near a restricted military zone. When he approached her, she pulled out a map and claimed in broken English to be lost. But the officer noticed she wasn't looking at the tourist landmarks. Her eyes were fixed on the truck convoy carrying covered equipment toward the launch site. The Norwegian Secret Service, the PST, now stepped into the shadows behind the local police. They began to realize that the Isdalen incident wasn't just a murder, it was a security breach. If she was a spy, who was she working for? In 1970, the obvious answer was the Soviet Union or a Warsaw Pact nation. But her high-end lifestyle, her continental accent, and her expensive dental work suggested something more complex. Some theorized she was a honey trap or a courier, while others suspected she was a freelance operative selling secrets to the highest bidder in a world where information was the most valuable currency. Then came the report from the mountain. A local man who had been hiking in the hills near the missile range days before the body was found claimed he saw the woman meeting two men. They weren't Norwegians. He described them as foreign-looking, dressed in suits that were too formal for the rugged terrain. He said they seemed to be arguing. When the woman noticed the hiker, she immediately stopped talking and turned her face away. The men looked at the hiker with a coldness that made him hurry past, his heart racing. It was the last time anyone saw her alive before she reached the Valley of Death. The investigation's military involvement changed the tone of the investigation. Files that were once open became classified. Surveillance footage from ports was seized. The police were told to tread carefully. It became clear that the Isdal Woman had touched something far more dangerous than she could handle. She had been playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse in the fjords, but the cats were no longer just police officers. They were intelligence agencies with the power to make people disappear. The most damning piece of evidence for the military theory was the timing of her death. She was found on the mountainside just days after the final and most successful test of the Penguin missile system. Her mission, whatever it was over. Perhaps she knew too much. Perhaps she had outlived her usefulness. Or perhaps she had been burned, her cover blown, her network compromised. In the world of espionage, a burned agent is a liability that must be disposed of with total finality. As the detectives looked back at the Valley of Death, they saw it in a new light. It wasn't just a remote spot for a suicide. It was a dead drop or a meeting point that had turned into a trap. The fire wasn't just a way to kill, it was a way to sanitize. By burning her body and her belongings, her killers weren't just ending her life, they were protecting the secret she carried. The shadow of the Penguin missile hung over the valley, a silent witness to a woman who had died for a secret that was still classified 50 years later. The final days of the Isdal Woman were a frantic dance between shadow and light. By November 23, 1970, the woman who had lived 1,000 lives in the luxury hotels of Europe was beginning to unravel. The cool, calculated discipline that had allowed her to manage 8 identities was being replaced by a visible, bone-deep desperation. She had just checked out of the Hotel Marlin in Bergen, but instead of heading to the airport or a pier to flee the country, she did something that defied all logic. She vanished into the local crowd, moving with the jagged, nervous energy of someone who knew they were being hunted. For the next 4 days, her trail becomes a series of fragmented sightings. She was seen at the Bergen railway station, not boarding a train, but sitting on a bench for hours, staring at the clock. Witnesses described her as looking transformed. The elegant traveler had been replaced by a woman who looked exhausted,
her eyes sunken, her hands trembling as she lit one cigarette after another. She was seen in a local cafe where she sat with a glass of water, her eyes darting to every person who walked through the door. She wasn't waiting for a friend, she was waiting for a predator. Then came the afternoon of November 24th. A local woman reported a bizarre encounter in the hills near the Isdalen Valley. She saw a woman matching the Miss Locke description walking toward the entrance of the ravine. But she wasn't dressed for a hike. She was wearing her city clothes, her stylish coat and thin-soled shoes, entirely unsuitable for the mud and the steep, rocky terrain of the Valley of Death. The witness noted that the woman looked terrified, her face pale as she moved toward the shadows of the mountains. Behind her, at a distance, followed two men in dark coats. They didn't look like hikers, they moved with a synchronized, predatory grace. They weren't following her, they were hurting her. The timeline suggests that the Isdal woman spent her final nights in the wilderness. There were no hotel records for her after the 23rd. Imagine the scene, a woman who had spent months in the finest suites in Europe, now shivering in a cold, damp cave or under a rocky overhang in the Isdalen. Why didn't she call for help? Why didn't she go to the police? The answer lies in the world she belonged to. In the world of high-stakes espionage, there is no help. There is only the mission or the silence. She had been burned, her contacts had gone dark, and she was now a liability that the system was preparing to erase. On the morning of November 29th, the trap was finally sprung. Forensic evidence suggests she was led to the remote spot where the body was found. She was forced to sit down among the cold stones. It was there that the prep began. The 50 to 70 sleeping pills were administered, possibly forced, or perhaps taken by her as a final, desperate act to numb what she knew was coming. The bottle of liquor was likely used to wash them down, ensuring they hit her system with maximum speed. As she drifted into a drug-induced haze, unable to scream or run, the gasoline was poured. The final moments were a nightmare of fire and smoke. The investigators believed she was still breathing when the match was struck. The soot in her lungs told the story of a final, agonizing gasp of air filled with the fumes of her own destruction. She was a woman who had lived by deception, and she died in a blaze intended to make that deception permanent. The men who had followed her into the valley disappeared back into the mist of Bergen, leaving behind a blackened husk that they believed would never be given a name. As the sun set on November 29th, the ice valley went silent once again. The woman who had been Alexia Zarna-Merced, Vera Schlosseneck, and Claudia Tielt was gone. In her place was a charcoal silhouette on a mountainside, a ghost whose last journey had ended in a tomb of rock and ash. The police were left with the luggage, the codes, and the toothless remains, but the living soul of the Isdal woman had been successfully deleted. The investigation was just beginning, but for her, the mission and the terror was over.
Among all the physical evidence found in the suitcases at the Bergen railway station, nothing fascinated the investigators more than a small, unassuming notebook. It was a diary, but not one of feelings or memories. Its pages were filled with columns of a cryptic, handwritten code that seemed to bridge the gap between a business log and a high-level military cipher. This notebook was the Isdal woman's shadow, the only surviving record of her internal world, and the police knew that if they could break it, they might finally hear her true voice. The code was a series of alphanumeric sequences, letters like N, O, P, and R, followed by dates and mysterious single characters. For days, the best cryptographers in Norway sat in a cramped room, surrounded by coffee cups and cigarette smoke, trying to find the pattern. They looked for mathematical shifts, for linguistic clues, for anything that would unlock the woman's movements. Then, a breakthrough came from a young detective who noticed a simple correlation. He realized the letters didn't represent a secret language, but a calendar and a map. N was for November, O was for October. The numbers were the days of the month. The notebook was a detailed travel log of a professional who never stayed in one place long enough to leave a shadow. By decoding the entries, the police were able to retrace her steps with terrifying precision. She had been a ghost haunting the borders of Europe. In March, she was in Geneva. By April, she was in Paris. In May, she was seen in London, and then the trail led to Hamburg and Basel. The notebook proved that she was a woman of immense resources, moving across the continent with the fluidity of someone who carried a diplomatic pouch or a weapon. But the most chilling part of the diary wasn't where she had been, but how she recorded it. Every city was given a single letter code. Bergen was B, Trondheim was T, Stavanger was S. But some codes remained uncracked, letters that didn't correspond to any known city. Were these meeting points, dead drops in the middle of the wilderness, or secret military zones that didn't appear on any civilian map? The notebook suggested that Norway was only the final act of a much larger global play. As the cryptographers dug deeper, they found something even more disturbing.
In the margins of the travel log were small, neat calculations. They weren't expenses for hotels or meals. They were time intervals. She was timing things. The intervals matched the departure times of naval vessels and the launch sequences of experimental rockets. She was a human stopwatch, a living instrument of observation. This diary was the proof the Norwegian intelligence service needed. She wasn't a victim of a crime of passion. She was a collector of secrets. The diary also revealed her discipline. There were no names of contacts, no phone numbers, no addresses. She had been trained to carry her network in her head and only the hard data on paper. But as the police looked at the very last entry, dated just days before her death, they saw a change in the handwriting. The elegant slanted script had become jagged and rushed. The final entry was simply a date and a location, the Isdalen Valley. It was as if she had written her own appointment with death. The notebook was a window into the mind of a professional who lived in a state of constant low-level war. It showed a woman who was meticulously organized, yet fundamentally alone. Every entry was a testament to a life lived in transit, a life where home was a code and identity was a temporary mask. The diary didn't give her a name, but it gave her a purpose. She was a bridge between the visible world and the world of shadows, a woman who carried the weight of the Cold War in a small, leather-bound book. When the news of the decoded diary reached the press, the public was captivated. They imagined a beautiful spy outwitting the authorities, a Mata Hari of the fjords. But for the investigators, the notebook was a tragedy. It was the record of a woman who had meticulously planned every day of her life, only to end up in a place where no code could save her. The diary was placed in a high-security vault, its secrets partially redacted, but its message was clear. The Isdal woman was a ghost who had finally been caught in her own web. The next scene would take us to the graveyard, where the woman of 1,000 names would finally be laid to rest under a single nameless stone.
By February 1971, the trail had gone cold. The police had followed every lead from the suitcases, the coded diary, and the hotel registrations, but they had arrived at a dead end. The woman who had lived in the finest suites of Europe was now nothing more than a file number in a cabinet. The legal system required a resolution. The body could no longer remain on a steel table in the Gade Institute. It was time for the Isdal woman to be returned to the earth, but even her burial would be conducted with a level of secrecy and strangeness that befitted her life. The funeral took place on February 5, 1971, at the Millendal Cemetery in Bergen. It was a day as gray and weeping as the day she was found. There were no grieving relatives, no floral tributes from friends, no photographs on the altar. The only people in attendance were 16 members of the Bergen police force, men who had spent months obsessed with her face, her teeth, and her fingerprints, but who still didn't know her name. They stood in a semicircle, their hats held against their chests, acting as the only family she had left in the world. She was buried in a zinc coffin. This was a highly unusual and expensive choice, made under direct orders from the authorities. A zinc coffin is hermetically sealed. It prevents the body from decomposing at a normal rate. The message was clear. The Norwegian government wasn't ready to let go of her forever. They believed that one day, science or a breakthrough in intelligence would provide an answer, and they wanted her body preserved, just in case she needed to be exhumed and questioned again by the technology of the future. The service was performed by a priest who had never met her. He spoke in generalities about the unknown sister and the lonely traveler. His voice echoed in the small chapel, a hollow sound for a woman whose life had been a symphony of lies. As the coffin was lowered into the frozen ground, a heavy silence fell over the cemetery. There was no headstone. In its place was a small, generic marker that bore no name, only a date and a file number. She was being buried in a section for the unknown, a corner of the graveyard reserved for the forgotten. But as the police turned to leave, a final piece of evidence surfaced in the form of a witness report that had been delayed by the bureaucracy. A man who lived near the cemetery claimed that on the morning of the funeral, he saw a black car with diplomatic plates parked near the gates. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hat, stood by the car for the duration of the service. He didn't approach the grave, and he didn't speak to the officers. As soon as the last shovelful of dirt hit the zinc lid, the man got back into his car and drove away. Was it a handler paying his final respects to a fallen asset? Or a hunter making sure his prey was finally, truly gone? The funeral marked the end of the active police investigation, but the start of the legend. The Isdal woman was now literally underground, her secrets sealed in zinc and stone. The case files were moved to the archives, stamped with a restricted seal that would not be broken for decades. The public began to move on, but in the dark corners of intelligence agencies from Oslo to Moscow, her story was still being told. She was the operative who had been erased, the woman who had achieved the ultimate goal of a spy. She had become a ghost that even death could not identify. The grave at Millendal became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those obsessed with the mystery.
Occasionally, a single red rose would appear on the nameless plot, left by someone who never identified themselves. The Valley of Death had claimed her body, and the zinc coffin had claimed her remains, but the mystery of the Isdal Woman was now part of the very soil of Bergen. As the years turned into decades, the world would change. The Cold War would end, the Berlin Wall would fall, but the woman in the zinc coffin remained the same, a silent sentinel of a world built on secrets.
For 46 years, the woman in the zinc coffin remained a ghost of the Cold War, a footnote in the dark history of espionage. The case files gathered dust in the Bergen police archives, and the mystery seemed destined to die with the generation of detectives who first climbed into the Valley of Death. But in 2016, the silence was broken. A new generation of investigators, armed with technology that the officers of 1970 could only have dreamed of, decided to pull the Isdal Woman back from the void. It was time for the secrets hidden in her bones to finally speak. The reopening of the case was not sparked by a new witness or a deathbed confession, but by the relentless march of science. Under the direction of the Norwegian broadcaster NRK and a team of international experts, the investigation turned to the only piece of the woman that hadn't been erased, her biology. They returned to the God Institute, searching for the tissue samples and dental remains that had been meticulously preserved by Dr. Geertsen decades earlier. They found them, tiny fragments of a woman who had been dead for nearly half a century, now destined to become the most analyzed remains in Norwegian history. The first breakthrough came from the teeth. Using a cutting-edge technique called stable isotope analysis, scientists examined the chemical signatures locked in her tooth enamel. Your teeth are a geological diary of your childhood. The water you drink and the food you eat leave a permanent isotopic record of the soil and climate of your birthplace. The results were staggering. The Isdal Woman wasn't from Norway, nor was she the Slovenian or Belgian traveler she claimed to be. The isotopes pointed directly to the border region between Germany and France, specifically the area around Alsace and Lorraine. This discovery provided a new, heartbreaking context to her continental accent and her multiple languages. She had likely been a child during the upheaval of World War II, moving across borders in a region that changed hands between nations. The analysis suggested she had moved slightly south and west as a teenager, potentially to the outskirts of Paris. She was a child of a fractured Europe, a girl who grew up in the shadow of one war, only to be consumed by the darkness of another, the Cold War. Next came the DNA. A team of top geneticists managed to extract a full profile from her remains. They compared her markers against massive global databases, looking for anyone who shared her blood. While they didn't find a direct match, they found cousins, distant branches of a family tree rooted in the Franco-German borderlands. The genetic map confirmed the isotopes. She was Western European, likely of a specific ethnic heritage that had been displaced or relocated during the 1940s. This explained her elegant yet hard-to-place features. She was a blend of the very heart of the continent. As the scientific results were made public, the world's digital detectives joined the hunt. Thousands of people across the globe began scouring old-school records, baptismal certificates, and refugee manifests from the 1930s and 40s. They were looking for a girl who vanished, a daughter who never came home. The DNA profile gave her a face that was no longer just a police sketch. It was a biological reality. She was a real person, with real parents and a real childhood in a French-speaking village or a German town. The 2016 investigation also used modern chemistry to re-examine her spy kit. They analyzed the composition of the gold in her teeth and the specific chemicals in the ink of her coded diary. Everything pointed back to the same conclusion. She was an operative of immense value, supported by a network that had access to high-end, specialized resources. But even with her DNA on a screen, the most haunting question remained. If we now knew where she was from, why did no one ever report her missing? The answer, scientists and historians now believe, lies in the erasure itself. If she was a sleeper agent or a high-level courier, her family might have been told she died years earlier, or she might have been an orphan of the war, a woman with no one left to look for her. The DNA revolution had given the Isdal Woman a geography, but it hadn't yet given her a name. She was no longer a total ghost, but she was still a prisoner of her own secrets. The grave at Mullendal was still nameless, but the earth was beginning to yield to the light of the 21st century. For decades, the official narrative of the Isdal Woman was built on police reports, forensic data, and the silent evidence of suitcases. But in the wake of the 2016 investigation, a new and terrifying piece of the puzzle emerged, not from a test tube, but from the memory of a man who had remained silent for nearly 50 years. His name was Ketil Kversoy, and in 1970, he was a young man out for a hike in the very hills where the woman would soon meet her end. His testimony, suppressed or ignored at the time, would change the story from a lonely suicide into a cold-blooded hunt. It was November 24, 1970, just 5 days before the body was found. Ketil was walking on a path leading toward the Isdalen Valley when the weather began to turn. The typical Bergen mist was rolling in, turning the forest into a world of gray ghosts. As he rounded a bend, he saw her. The woman was walking toward him, but she wasn't alone. She was dressed in elegant city clothes, a stylish coat and a scarf that looked absurdly out of place among the mud and the jagged rocks. Behind her, keeping a steady, disciplined distance, were 2 men in dark overcoats. As they passed each other, Ketil made eye contact with the woman. He never forgot the expression on her face. It wasn't the look of a tired traveler or a confused tourist. It was the look of a woman who was staring into her own grave. Her eyes were wide, filled with a primal, paralyzing terror. She opened her mouth as if to speak, as if to scream for help, but then she looked at the 2 men behind her. Her face went slack, a mask of total resignation. She knew that if she spoke, she would die right there, and she knew that if she didn't, she was walking toward her end anyway. The men following her didn't look like hikers. They didn't have backpacks or walking sticks. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace. They looked like security, the kind of men who exist in the shadows of embassies and government buildings. They didn't acknowledge Ketil. They simply stared through him, their eyes as cold as the Norwegian fjords. As the trio disappeared into the thick fog of the Valley of Death, Ketil felt a wave of dread so powerful that he turned and ran. He went to the police shortly after the body was found, but he was told to go home. "Forget what you saw," they said. "This case is bigger than you." This witness report, combined with modern analysis, paints a devastating new picture of the Isdal woman's final hours. She wasn't a solitary wanderer seeking peace. She was a captive being escorted to her execution. The Isdalen Valley wasn't her choice. It was her destination. The 2 men were likely her handlers or her executioners, professionals who had been sent to clean up a liability. They had herded her into the most desolate part of the ravine, far from any help, where the wind would carry away any sound and the rain would wash away any footprints. The presence of the men explains the clean state of the crime scene. It explains why her labels were gone and why her jewelry was left behind. It was a professional sanitization. They had forced her to sit, forced her to take the pills, and then waited until she was unconscious before applying the gasoline. They didn't just want her dead, they wanted her deleted. They were the ones who had likely returned her suitcases to the station and watched her funeral from a black car with diplomatic plates. Ketil's story turned the suicide theory on its head. The Isdal woman wasn't a victim of her own mind. She was a victim of a system. She had been caught in the crossfire of the Cold War, a woman who knew too much about the Penguin missiles or the secret naval codes. She was a ghost who had tried to run, but in the world of 1970s espionage, there was no place on Earth far enough. As Ketil stood in the Isdalen Valley decades later, pointing to the spot where they passed, the mist seemed to thicken once again. The woman in the mist was no longer a mystery to him. She was a human being he had failed to save. Her terrified gaze remained the most honest piece of evidence in the entire case. It was the only time her true self, the frightened woman behind the 8 passports, had ever been seen. The final scene would not bring her back, but it would attempt to give her the one thing the men in the dark coats tried to steal, a legacy that refuses to be forgotten.
The file on the Isdal woman has never been officially closed, but it has transitioned from a police report into a haunting piece of European folklore. More than half a century has passed since that cold November morning in 1970, yet the Valley of Death continues to draw those who seek the truth behind the ash. The woman who tried so hard to become no one has, in a strange twist of fate, become one of the most talked about individuals in the history of Norway. Her legacy is not one of a name or a family tree, but of a question that refuses to be silenced. How can a human being be so thoroughly erased in a world that never stops watching? Today, the Mjølndal Cemetery in Bergen is a place of quiet reflection. The nameless grave is still there, but it is no longer ignored. People from all over the world, researchers, historians, and true crime enthusiasts visit the plot, often leaving flowers or small tokens. They aren't mourning a stranger, they are honoring a victim of a shadow war that consumed a generation.
The zinc coffin remains sealed beneath the soil, holding its silent occupant and the biological secrets that science is still trying to unlock. She has become a symbol of the displaced, the millions of souls caught in the gears of the 20th century's great ideological battles. The impact of the Isdal Woman extends far beyond the borders of Norway. Her case changed the way international police forces handle unidentified remains. It became a masterclass in forensic anthropology and a cautionary tale about the limits of traditional investigation. The 2016 DNA breakthrough proved that even the most professional erasure leaves a biological footprint. It sent a message to the shadows. No matter how many labels you cut, no matter how many passports you forge, the truth is written in the marrow of the bone, and eventually the earth will give up its secrets. In the Isdalen Valley itself, nature has done its best to reclaim the site. Moss has grown over the boulders where the fire once burned. The sharp scent of gasoline has long been replaced by the smell of damp pine and mountain air. But for those who know the story, the atmosphere remains heavy. When the mist rolls in from the North Sea and blankets the ravine in gray, it's easy to imagine the elegant woman in the city coat, walking toward her end. The valley remains a monument to the high cost of secrets and the cold reality of a life lived in the shadows. There are still those who believe that somewhere in an archive in Moscow, Berlin, or Tel Aviv, there is a folder with her real name on it. A folder that explains her mission, her handlers, and the reason she had to die. Perhaps one day, a final document will be declassified, or a distant relative will upload their DNA to a database, and the Isdal Woman will finally get her name back. She will cease to be a ghost and become a daughter, a sister, a person with a hometown and a childhood. Until that day, she remains the woman of the Ice Valley. She is the ultimate mystery of the Cold War, a woman who lived as a lie and died for a secret. Her story serves as a reminder that behind every spy thriller is a human life, full of fear, ambition, and loneliness. As the screen fades to black and the wind whistles through the Norwegian peaks, we are left with her haunting gaze. The gaze of a woman who was erased from history, but who found immortality in the very mystery of her own destruction. The Valley of Death is silent now, but the world is still listening for her name.